Von Petzinger, that sounds German.
Oh, yeah, that's like Prussian Germans. That was my married name. I'm very British/Scandinavian myself.
First of all, thank you for doing this. And second of all, I never write questions, but for you, I had to write questions.
And also, I should warn you, I get really excited and I talk a lot. So if you need to redirect me, I will not be offended, okay? So cut me off if you need to. It's all good.
First of all, when I saw your TED Talk, I was amazed how these 32 signs and everything that you spoke about it, how somebody came up with it. Yes, I was jealous about your brilliance. I was so inspired by you. You are not boring when reading. I read a lot of history of art books, and they are so boring I want to die. But your book and how you express your feelings towards what you found out, how you get with some people who are definitely not wanting to be there, but because of some dot in the cave, they have to go with you.
Yeah.
And it's so engaging book.
But, thank you.
What inspired you to become what you are now?
My first love was dinosaurs. I mean, whose isn't? So I was one of those precocious, like 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds who could like do the huge Latin names for all the dinosaurs. And then as I got a little bit older, I decided that humans were a bit more interesting, but I really like digging. My parents were very supportive. And we were in Canada, and so I'm in British Columbia is where I grew up. And so when I was 8, I guess, our summer vacation, my parents took us, my poor younger sister who got dragged along. We went to, it's like the Badlands area in Canada where like the Royal Tyrrell Museum is there, and it's a huge dinosaur fossil area. And I got to even help excavate a bone out in the landscape, and it like my 8-year-old brain like exploded. So that was, I think, where I was like, there are treasures in the earth, right? And so as I got older, though, I realized humans were just a bit more interesting. When I went to university, I didn't know at that point that I wanted to do Stone Age stuff. I knew I wanted to do archaeology. And my first excavation that I ever did was actually in the Middle East. It was in Jordan. And it was a Roman excavation. So way younger. The Romans were just way too organized for me. Do you know what I mean? Like it was like this. I mean, it's a great site. It's called Al Humaima, and it's still there. But the beautiful day was one day they let me do surveying. Because I should point out, too, that I am neurodivergent and I'm not very good at details. So I also discovered I wasn't very good at excavating little squares. Like the sides of my squares were always crooked, because they use a plumb bob. I got a chance to go survey on the landscape. And the surveying blew my mind. That idea of being out in the land, this incredible desert, and I was out there standing by myself and looking for new sites. And I mean, that was the moment where I was like, this is the kind of archaeology I want to do. And then on top of that, I realized that everything was too organized with the Romans, and I was much more interested in the beginnings of things. I also made wonderful friends 20 years later. It's been 20 years, actually, since I did that first excavation as an undergrad. I'm still friends with some of the Bedouin I worked with. And now they've got families and kids. And so when I go back, I actually go stay with them in the Mohayyam out in the camps. That's who I'm staying with. Some of these guys, I've known them for 20 years. Wow. So yeah, I'm kind of like an adopted member of the family. But that was where I went back. I ended up taking this course on Paleolithic art just because it sounded neat. And I got introduced to cave art for the very first time, really. And I was just like, now this is old enough. Yeah. This is the beginnings. This is what I'm interested in. How did things start? And that was really where I fell madly in love with it. And then I like patterns. I like abstract stuff. I like early writing. So I think it was almost a sort of a natural progression. I'm an aspiring philologist. So, of course, philologists study dead languages. It was a thing during the Victorian era. It's not really a job anymore. So, we have to become archaeologists.
Well, I remember when I was 8 or 9, I didn't have a lot of books. Cousin of my mother worked in a publishing house, and he gave me a book called My First Encyclopedia, and it was red. I still have it. It was prehistoric people, with drawings, with cave art, with everything that you can imagine.
Yeah.
I think the book was made in the 80s, but it was 90s that I got the book. So everything to that point that was discovered about cave art and cave people, and it was Australopithecus, Homo erectus, then Neanderthal, and then Homo sapiens. There was a lot of drawings and how they lived, and there was a section about art.
Oh,
And I was
okay.
looking at, and there was a painting somebody illustrated, a shaman-looking guy making hand stencil,
Yeah.
and it says that was made 21,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, 20,000 years ago or so.
Mm-hmm.
In that small age, I realized, oh my God, I want to be artist, because 20,000 years later, we are still watching and admire what they did. And I'm like, that's my calling. And
Oh, that's amazing. So you've got a really deep connection to back into your child. Oh, that's so cool.
and also there was this dude, his name is Dado. When I told him that story 20 years later, he cried. But
Oh,
he made this drawing on Marilyn Monroe, and his mom was very proud. Look what my son did, and went around. And I
yeah.
looked at it, and I said, oh my God, I want to do this. And that's
Okay.
how I'm interested in Paleolithic art and also modern art and history. I went a little bit on a tangent here, sorry, because I'm very excited
No,
talking to you.
it's a good tangent. Well, I mean, I think, but again, remember, I'm interested in the origins of things. So we're talking about the origins of Genevieve doing archaeology, the origins of Eldon and his art. It's perfect.
Yeah.
So
all of the people that I wanted to speak with, it's very hard to get to them, like you or Daniele Bolelli or this guy that made amazing book called Sex at Dawn. Have you read it?
Ooh, no. Oh my.
This art history is based on your book, Daniele Bolelli's How to Create Your Own Religion, and this book called Sex at Dawn. And it's very controversial in USA.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's called Sex at Dawn. I mean, the book is mind-blowing. It shows how we evolve our sexuality.
Ooh, okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh, interesting. Okay. I'll have to check it out.
My question was, how did you conduct the research for the first science? What was the first initial thought that you had?
Yeah. So my strength, I think one of the things about, being in my 40s now is I've had enough time to figure out what are my strengths, what are challenge areas, kind of like we've already discussed. Genevieve's not so good at the squares. But one of the things that is definitely my strength is I'm very good at like macro level thinking. I like big patterns. I like big data sets. So right from the beginning, frankly, even as an undergrad when I first saw the geometric signs or then moving into doing graduate work, I've always had visions of the signs being these incredibly useful indicators of how these ancient people were thinking. Like, I think that was always been the connection for me is the art is amazing. There's that resonance, I think, with us, with the aesthetic, with that idea of creation. But I think what makes the art also useful from a scientific point of view, because my brain's like, I've got like the two pieces of my brain, both of which get really activated by this. But if you're going to go on like the science side, art is a really interesting window into the minds of these ancient people. And it's especially interesting because they didn't have to make it. There's nothing about it from a very practical, ground up approach of it doesn't keep you warm at night. It doesn't put food on the table. Like there's nothing directly useful about it. And I'm using useful with air quotes for the audience because obviously it's incredibly useful, but just, basic survival, you don't need it, right? Why were they doing this? What was the motivation? What was the purpose? Again, obviously, by the time we're talking about Homo sapien, we're talking about people with the same brains as us. So maybe they did it for the joy. I'm sure for you as an artist, there is a certain joyful aspect of creation flowing through your fingers. But also, I mean, when the art is so varied, I think there's also functional and purposeful and educational and like so there's lots of things going on. And so I think that where I saw what the signs would be so incredibly useful for, even more than, say, no offense to the prancing ponies and the big fancy mammoth, but that the signs in particular were things that I could track across space and time. And so that this was to me where I was like, I bet you we could figure out things about how cultures changed, about how new ideas spread, about how these people were moving across the landscape. And I mean, I think at the core of so much of this for me is always the question of when did we become us? I feel like art provides a different window into the minds of these people because of the much more symbolic aspect to it. I mean, our entire modern civilization is literally grounded in graphic communication. Whether we're talking about the written word, whether we're talking about mathematics, computer coding, we could not put people on the moon without visual marks. Like literally, if those people had not invented those things, we would not be where we are now. So I think that is also what really intrigues me, is to understand, how did this happen? Why did our ancestors go in this different route than any other, sort of branch of the tree of life has ever gone on? And is this the thing that made the difference? I'm very interested in these big questions. And so where did this come from? How old is it? Where did it start? So those are always big questions I had. During graduate school, I was rightly narrowed down because they were like, you can't do the world. That's not how this works. So it's like, that's the big goal. But, so I started by using France as a test case, because France had really good records that already existed. They've been studying those sites for over 100 years. And so what it allowed me to do was to come in at that higher level, the big macro scale, and for the first time, put all of those sites, all those archaeological reports into a single data source, so a database, and then to look to see, do the same signs repeat across time and space? Like, are there patterns to how they're being used? Do things get invented? Is there start and end points? Can we start, again, using it as a way to sort of fill in these really ancient chapters in human history where we're missing a lot? That was kind of where the signs to me were just incredibly intriguing on a lot of different levels. And that was a really long answer, but there you go.
No. You are answering my questions.
Good.
When I read these books about art, what most of people who write these books, and you're not one of them, but they're so boring. They really don't understand artistic processes. I'm trying to invent these stories to explain people how certain artwork was made. Yeah. And when people see, for example, a handprint in France, but also in Indonesia, in Sulawesi.
Yeah.
I think it's 54 now.
Yeah, I think it was 51,200 was, I believe, the main dates. But yeah, and that's for actual, like, figurative. That's a scene, which is even more interesting.
Yes. My question for you is there something in human psyche that we have and are drawn to the same patterns? Or is it cultural?
Ooh, good one. Okay, so first of all, I have to say thank you about the nice things about my book. I had so much fun writing it. I think at my core, I'm a storyteller. I like telling stories. And so sometimes those are science communication stories. Sometimes those are hardcore academic stories. I also even do full narrative stuff too, as well. So I like to do a bit of everything. Yeah, so that was such a fun book to write because I'd been doing so much heavy like thesis writing and dissertation stuff. And it was like my agent was like, and my editor were like, you mean I can use adjectives? I can tell caving stories? And I was like, oh, let it go. Like, let's have some fun with this. I had a really good time writing that book. So I hope that came through, that I actually had fun. I had a fun time writing it. Yeah.
It was amazing reading it.
Oh my gosh, like that time I almost got stuck. I've almost got stuck even worse since then, so we can talk about that. So, no, it's good. It just happened this year, actually. But it was fun. It was a good time. I wasn't actually worried. But I was like, ooh, this is pretty close to stuck. I think, again, because I come from the storyteller side of things, and while I like hard science, my natural nature is maybe not that very detailed oriented, very methodical, which again, bless my colleagues. I need them. We need them. They're the ones who go through and do these incredibly important detailed studies, which give us the data. I have colleagues who get so focused on the details of the science that I think maybe they forget about the soul. Does that make sense? Oh my gosh, one of my lovely colleagues, we were having a conversation about skulls because she's a bioanthropologist. So she looks at like Neanderthal fossils and things like that. And we were talking about the site, I believe it's in Shanidar in Iran, and she's worked there. And we were talking about there's one burial there which has...
For the people who don't know what Shanidar is.
Oh, yes, sorry. Okay, so yeah, sorry. Shanidar Cave in Iran, and it's, it's in Iraq, not Iran, it's in Iraq, up in the northern Kurdish area. Shanidar is a cave where they have found a whole lot of Neanderthal burials. And it's one of the places where one of the burials may or may not have had flowers placed on it. That remains a bit of a controversy. I mean, I like to think that they did place flowers, but it may be pollen that blew in. But yeah, there's lots of variation on age and, sex. So there's like male, female, adult, more juvenile. And there's this one gentleman in particular who was found, he had died with, it looked like it was a spear thrust. or like it was a thrown spear. And so the big question was, to the best of everyone's knowledge, Neanderthals only had thrusting spears. So they had to get really, really close to like the mammoth or to whatever it was they were hunting and then like jam it in. Versus the humans, who appear to have invented spears that could be thrown from a greater distance, which again would be a working smarter, not harder thing to do. So good choice, humans. This particular Neanderthal seemed to have died from this injury from a thrown spear, which made it seem like maybe it was a human had attacked the Neanderthal, which again, we have so little evidence of violence. There's almost no evidence of violence in the Paleolithic. People have all sorts of weird ideas. It's actually agriculture is where everybody starts fighting, but that's a whole other tangent. I was talking with my colleague and we were having this laugh because I was like, instantly I was, I wonder if it was a love triangle. Did the humans come and like interact with the Neanderthals and something went horribly wrong? And so I made up this whole story about it, and we had a good laugh about the fact that the bioanthropologists focus on the facts. They focus on let's analyze the wound or let's look at stone tools. I skew more to the creative a little bit, so I think this is where art appeals to me in a way that, you know, again, that's why we call them the stones and bones people. I say that with love, but who tend to be more focused on, again, we need those details. Everybody can feel the love and respect I have for those folks, and many of them are my teammates and colleagues. But I think maybe we need a few more people like me who tend to have big imaginations and start filling in the gaps. So I completely understand what you're doing too, Eldon, because that's what makes it relatable. That's the level at which we care in a different way.
There's a hunger and need that I noticed through my podcast for this kind of not only storytellings that I invented, but also to explain people, this is Venus of Willendorf, and people are responding good. I get a lot of mails. Of course, there's people who are saying that I'm bad at what I'm doing, but most of the mails that I get, and from the people that I admire also, telling me that I'm doing a good job. When you spoke about these 32 distinct type of geometric signs, and you identified them, can you explain how did you saw these connections, and are they across all of the Europe, across all of the world, or in just specific time period or geography?
This is the life question that I'm trying to answer. I love it. Okay, so this is my opinion. Many of my colleagues agree, but they're absolutely allowed to disagree too. That is what makes science so fun. And it doesn't even matter if I'm wrong. Like, I think the whole point is to push forward, and if we need to correct, we correct. It's all good. That's yay science. But my instinct, which of course is terrible as a scientist, but my gut instinct, often the way this works is I get a feeling this is how something is. And it's, again, I'm sure at some level I'm seeing the patterns is what it is. And then I design a study to go see if I can test it, is basically how this works. So this is kind of how Genevieve combines maybe the creative side of her brain with the side. I am absolutely fascinated by trying to understand where and when did the very first graphic marks happen. My instinct, my feeling on it from everything I have seen in recent years is that this is something that traces back to before Homo sapien. I suspect it goes back to our common ancestor, to Homo erectus. And I think that is actually where the very first marks came from, which is just fascinating to try and understand where did they start. And also the fact that they kept putting this time and effort into it suggests that whatever that purpose was, it was useful, right? It was either useful or it was appreciated or whatever it was that was happening. There was a positive effect from them doing this. And so it was worth continuing to do, right? And so I think that I'm really intrigued by trying to understand that. I feel like the geometric signs in particular, they change less over time and space in the sense that you are not going to find a mammoth being drawn in Australia. You are not going to find the warty pig from Sulawesi in a cave in Spain. Like, it's not going to happen, right? So animals tend to be a reflection of the physical landscape where they live versus I feel like the signs, because they are more abstracted, have the capacity to remain in use over much longer time periods and in much different geographic spaces. Now, the meaning could change, and so I think we have to be very careful about that, but the physical form of it is something that is trackable. And then also when it comes to finding first place, like first invention, or, I mean, I don't know if we can ever get to that point, but trying to track it backwards. My feeling on this is that if we continue to find older and older things, that the oldest marks in the world are probably lines, dots, and hands. And I think those are the ones that will track all the way backwards for us. Possibly also little cruciforms. I could see that as well, or zigzags. But I think it's going to be those simple linear marks, the dots and the hands will be the things that are the absolute oldest. And in places where we have started to find the very oldest art, those are the common denominators. We find those in all these different areas. And I don't think we independently invented exactly the same things. I think it's a little too precise, right? So it could very well be that I think you can have people in two different places be like, hey, we need to make a shelter from this wind. One group of people might decide to make something that serves a shelter purpose. One might make something square, one might make something round, one might be semi-subterranean. So there's going to be differences. So I think when we're seeing such strong similarities in the sense that we're finding hands, I believe that that tracks back to a common place of invention. And that these people took these signs with them as they moved out into the world. And that as they moved out into the world, the other art that they're creating starts to reflect the world in which they live. And also it explains why the further apart in time and space these people get, the greater the differences. The X-ray style that we find in Australia is very unique, and we don't find that in other places because that was an invention from their culture. Or the very naturalistic styling in Europe, like the three-quarter perspective or these different things, like there is independent invention in technique. There is new signs being invented in different parts of the world independently. But I think there's also some underlying universality, but not because of even certain things in the brain so much as maybe they come from a common place. Because I don't know if you knew this, but the latest genetics, everybody whose ancestors left Africa, and even many of the people who are in Africa, because, I mean, people moved out, people moved back. It wasn't a one-way street. Most of us alive today are descended from 10,000 people, which is insane.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the L haplogroup. And They lived in East Africa. People left earlier. There was earlier waves, but they all died out. It's called a local extinction. The only people who made it out alive, and these are our ancestors, are the ones who left between about 60 and 80,000 years ago. They are the people who populated Australia, Indonesia, Europe, the New World, the Americas, all that stuff. That's all from that one group from East Africa, from the haplogroup there. And so again, if they're all living in one place, they have the same very close genetics, they're probably the same culture. And probably what we're seeing is just that over time, these little groups of people who already had music, art, stories, culture, they took those with them as they went, because it was probably more like this particular group of 30 people saw some nice green pastures that way and off they went, and they just carried on. The likelihood they spoke the same language and all of those things is very, very high at first, and that it's only over time that we start to see this split and separation take place. What I see with the signs matches with that as well, which is there's greater continuity and similarity in the earliest art, and that over time we see greater and greater change as it's called cultural diffusion. So the idea as the cultures move out and they're no longer in contact, they're not sharing ideas. They're no longer, collectively moving their culture forward. They're now moving in different directions. This is where we start to see more difference. We see certain signs that were like the hands were very popular at first, for instance. The hands basically vanished from Europe by about 15, 20,000 years ago. I would even say maybe 20,000. So the making of hands lost its importance to them for whatever reason. And so I think we can learn a lot by connecting the people with the art and then looking at that change over time to understand maybe how these changes reflect changes in their world. A really long answer. Hopefully that kind of answered your question.
I have so many questions. One of them is, what do you think? This is just a hypothetical question, but you mentioned that there was no violence in Paleolithic and agricultural societies that moved and creeping on to Europe and Asia, and they kill all of those people, right?
Okay, no. So it's more of a gradual transition that takes place. The proper introduction of agriculture is something that really did come up from the sort of Middle Eastern region and was sort of dispersed across. But there's many places, including in the Balkans actually, where they actually appear to have settled down and lived side by side with the local hunter-gatherers.
What? Peace of Balkan?
Yes, yeah, living in peace in the Balkans. Who knew? This is about 8,000 years ago. Lipinski Veer, I believe, is the name of the site. It's too new for me. It's too young. I'm using air quotes, but yeah, there's really interesting examples of that transition. But yeah, I think there's a few things that happen. I'm sure there were still hierarchies of types within tribes. But if you're dealing with like 30-ish people, because the average tribe is going to be 30 to 50 people, you can't support yourselves on the land if you're too dense, right? Like you need these smaller groups. They probably just split off if they get too big, like family groups will leave or things will happen. But also, you need your neighbors. Like they are your friends, they are your trading partners, they are the people you can call on if you run into trouble. And also, those are the people you're going to intermarry with. When you're these small groups, the interdependence is huge. I'm sure occasionally there were fights and scraps about things, but overall, cooperation and having a social network was actually much more beneficial, as funny as that sounds. And when you're dealing with a time period where everybody had access to the same stuff, if you wanted a shell necklace, if you saw that your friend in the tribe had made themselves a shell necklace, you could go pick some shells up at the beach and make a necklace too, right? Everybody had access to the same stuff. Maybe some people were better at making beautiful figurines. Maybe somebody else was better at weaving or, doing art. Like everybody probably had these skills which they brought to the table, but everybody was only what they call a part-time specialist. What that means was that nobody back then probably would have been a full-time shaman. Everybody probably also hunted and gathered and fished. And then whatever their natural gifts were, that would have been what they brought to the table. But you kind of need everybody because you need somebody who's good at engineering. You need somebody who's good at art. You need somebody who's good at exploring or innovating or tending the home fires. Like there's lots of different things that you need in these groups. They tend to be quite egalitarian and quite cooperative, because we all need each other, and you kind of have to be a pleasant person, because if you're not, you're going to get kicked out of the group. And frankly, going it alone in the hunter-gatherer world is not an easy thing to do. It's not something most people would do by choice. I think in a really interesting way, agriculture changed the dynamic, because now as people were living in places where they had stuff that they were keeping to themselves, and it became more competitive than cooperative in many ways. And also you could get people who amassed more stuff. And also when you switch to like monocropping and things like that. So what we find is in some of the earliest larger settlements, some people are suffering really badly from malnutrition. They've forgotten how to hunt and gather, which is wild. But I mean, look at us, right? How many of us could really truly jump onto the land and feed ourselves if suddenly we lost access to grocery stores, right? So it's wild and fascinating to see that you start seeing a lot more malnutrition in people's bones, and you start seeing a lot more acts of violence, probably again because people are trying to protect stuff, because now it's not so much about cooperation as it is about competition and transaction. And so it's a really wild transition time that took place. Now, if it wasn't for that, we would not have had the capacity to create large urban societies, which is also really interesting to sort of see like the good and the bad sides of this, because we would not have been able to create the kinds of things we have like in this amazing world. Because I love living now. I would not want to live in any other time in history. I adore living in the present, and I look forward to the future. So I think in that sense, maybe there's some things that we need to readjust now. But that's where during the Paleolithic, people needed each other a lot more. And I think that is reflected in the culture. I think it's reflected in the art. What is interesting is that, say, up in the Gravettian, especially up along from the Czech Republic through to the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, so like that whole big, huge northern tundra area, which was basically one massive interconnected series sort of culture around 25,000-ish years ago. So many of the things you've spoken about came out of there too. That is the very first time that we see people settling down a little bit. And there, though, it's impermanent enough we don't see any greater signs of violence or anything. But what we do see is really interesting pockets of innovation, because also we need each other. We build off of each other's ideas. And so what happened I don't know for sure if it was the first time in human history this happened or if this happened in other places as well. But what it was that there was these huge ice sheets that were up there. And it was a weirdly dry period for an ice age. And so the animals all congregated at the base of the glaciers where the water dripped and made lots of tasty green things for them to eat. The humans figured out if they lived nearby, they could just literally go out and hunt at will without having to go looking. And so they started to create villages. Like, I'm going to completely mispronounce it. I heard you say it really nicely, and I'm going to do it really badly in English, but Dolny Vestinici and Pavlov and all those sites where for the first time we see them creating these larger settlements where maybe 50 people live together or 100 people live together. And for the first time, we start seeing greater specialization, which is just fascinating too. We start seeing them firing clay in kilns. And again, but you need to be more sedentary and located in one spot to be able to do these things, right? And so I think one of the reasons why the Gravettian was such an incredible time of invention and innovation was because it was like the perfect sweet spot of community and enough brains all working together to be like, hey, I saw so-and-so do this thing. I wonder if we added this to it, because we're so good at that as humans, like working together and collaborating, but not so big that we all started fighting with each other.
Yeah, I don't know.
There's my deep philosophical thought on like, but yeah, that would be what I've noticed is that it seems like the scales are tipped to cooperation over competition in general in the Paleolithic. And I think that is where we're seeing less violence.
I read a lot of books that are suggesting that there was a lot of violence, especially between Mesolithic and Neolithic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, again, we're getting towards the end of my area of knowledge.
Okay.
Like, I know a little bit beyond that. And I think it's very interesting because I do believe glimmers of those geometric signs and of Ice Age art in general came forward with those people. This is where the genetics is going to be really, really helpful, because I do also participate in some genetics projects, which I think like ancient DNA projects, which is fascinating. I think that's going to help us understand what was happening when it comes to being able to see whose genes were where when, and how were people moving around the landscape. And are we talking replacement? Are we talking integration? Because from a genetic level, we can see if people are integrating, right? And I believe that was what happened in the Balkans there, was that very rapidly you could see that people were interbreeding with each other. I don't know if interbreeding is quite the right word at that point, but they were starting to cross the lines between early agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers, and they were all living together in the same communities, which is an interesting piece as well. So this is where, and again, those are very early agriculture. Keep in mind that high population level, there was maybe 100,000 people in the whole of Europe. It's tiny. So there was tons of room. Like, nobody needed to fight with each other. The herds of animals were like the density of the Serengeti. There was massive herds of millions of like bison and horse and mammoth running around, depending on the time period. Insane as it sounds, because it was a chilly ice age, it was a wonderful place to live. There was lots of food, there was lots of things to be done, and our ancestors did a pretty fantastic job of innovating when they needed to. They invented clothing and did things. It was a really neat golden era, frankly, of humanity in many ways. I'm not making it perfect. Obviously, you could die in childbirth very easily. You could die from a tooth infection, like things could go wrong, but everything I've seen really doesn't show that much violence until, again, later. Now, transitionally, yes, I think that probably hunter-gatherers often get into fights with agriculturalists because hunter-gatherers want to hunt and wander through the land that these other people now think they own. But that probably did take more into the Neolithic for that to happen. I believe the Mesolithic was still, again, this more people were hunter-gathering and they were starting to do horticulture, agriculture. It was a bit of both.
Poetic side of me or storytelling side of me.
Yeah.
I always wondered how was it for these people who wandered Europe or Asia as well, Siberia. Yeah. And there is 50 people in my tribe and there's nobody around me. And suddenly I see a group of other people coming.
I know.
And
yes.
Do they exchange ideas? Do they fight? Do they intermarry? Do they have maybe yearly gatherings where all tribes of the area would come and congregate?
Yes, I've been to sites that are aggregation sites. So,
oh, wow.
Yes, I have been. So Isteritz, it's in the Pyrenees. So it's kind of like Isteritz Oshel-Sahaya. It's in this amazing part of French Basque Country. And I think it's called the Pyrénées Atlantiques, if I remember correctly, is the name of that province. And Halperin, I'm probably mispronouncing it. I can always give it to you, but that's the name of the town that's there. That site is literally the midpoint between northern Spain and the whole Dordogne region. It's a huge cave. I first visited it in 2013, I think, was the first time I was there. That main cave in Isteritz is like, it's the size of a football stadium practically. It's really big. It's got a huge ceiling, big spaces on the floor. They found 20 flutes in there. Yes, and these are like 35,000 plus in age, I believe. So they are old, and there is a lot of evidence for large aggregation of people. I think the reality is that, again, people needed each other. There was things they wanted to trade for, because not every territory would necessarily have good obsidian sources. So obsidian's that really hard stone volcanic rock that makes an amazing cutting edge. So maybe one group has some obsidian that they're bringing to the table. Maybe other people have really wonderful source of ochre that they're bringing. Or we've got some of those places too where they almost call them the Paleolithic workshops, where there was very skilled artisans making beautiful ivory beads and other items. And so I suspect that once a year or so, they met and they exchanged ideas. It was probably also an opportunity for the young people to eye up the young people from other tribes to see if anything looked interesting, to exchange stories, to talk about things maybe to worry about. But again, who was it? I have a colleague who studied the Khoisan down in Namibia, South Africa, that whole area. She's done a lot of really interesting work. And she said, contrary to most people's understanding, a lot of those people have connections to hundreds of people. Like they might live in their little tribal group, but they're so social. They're constantly reaching out. They've got cousins here and, a brother there or a sister there and their parents are over there. Like they're constantly interacting with other groups. She was saying it's definitely a bit of a misunderstanding in a way that we think of them as being isolated, but they can be very sociable. And again, having the overlap at these bigger yearly or who knows, like maybe, a couple times a year or who knows why, but that they would come together would be very advantageous to society. It would be interesting as an opportunity, again, to explore the movement of people, the movement of ideas. As our genetics gets better, our ability to do ancient genetics. Look at that pendant study that was just published, where they literally were able to rebuild the genetic profile of a woman who wore a necklace 25,000 years ago because it rubbed against her skin.
Oh, wow.
Like, isn't that insane? Because of the material, I can't remember if it was bone or tooth, but it sucked in her genetic material and held it there for 25,000 years. And we are at a point where we can rebuild from that level of fragmentation. Do we not live in the most amazing time? So the whole concept of how we study sites is changing right now. Yeah. My colleagues and I are starting to include genetic sampling as one of the things we do at sites now. We will in the future be able to rebuild the people. Isn't that amazing? And then we can connect it with the art and we can figure out how were these ideas moving around the landscape. Was it the same culture group? Was it the same people? Was it a family? Maybe there was one family that were really good artists and we might be able in the future to literally connect it between caves. Or a whole new culture group has moved in because we can see the genetics are completely different.
But we cannot see in genetics if somebody is a good artist or not.
Oh, but we can if we can extract genetic material directly from the paint.
Oh, okay, touche. Well, I thought like, this person was an artist because their DNA shows that these
No, I mean in a very practical, like literally this person spat paint on a wall. So again, if it's been in their mouth, there's proteins, there's things that get spat on the wall. And we are now literally at the point where we are starting to be able to extract genetic material from paint pigment and rebuild people. The concept of having direct evidence of the identity of an artist makes me so happy. From a storytelling point of view, isn't that amazing? We'll know if they're male or female. Like we can know so many things about them.
I had so many episodes saying that we will never know. Maybe we will. Who knows?
Oh, Eldon, all I can say for now is we will. Things aren't published now, but we will be able to tell.
I have to record and rewrite and everything. All of these episodes.
But you see, that's what science is all about, right? That's what makes it so beautiful. When I was an undergrad, we literally did not think that humans interbred with Neanderthals. And that was what I was taught. And that was the early 2000s, right? Now we know we most assuredly did, and probably more than once. And Neanderthals are part of our ancestral lineages now, we've realized. And also even in Africa, people even didn't realize that there are folks from Africa who also have Neanderthal DNA. The story is so much more complicated than we understood it was. And so for me, genetics is probably going to be one of the biggest additions to the field that is really going to help us start to understand the story at the individual level. And at the family level, the tribal level, there's going to be so much amazing stuff we can do.
So it's a big 3D jigsaw puzzle.
Yes, I love that. That is a beautiful way to put it. Yeah, and again, right now we only have little pieces. Like it's almost like it's like we're listening to a radio station, and right now we're trying to tune it in, and we're catching bits and pieces, but so much we don't know, you know. And it's like every new technology we add. I mean, doing a huge amount of work right now with artificial intelligence too. The doors it is opening are unbelievable. Like I am so excited for the future.
What I'm very interested in myself is in my research is art. Yeah, of course, we need to understand specific work of art. One needs to understand the circumstances when this art was created. But this side, it is, for me at least, when you mentioned that they found 20 flutes, the first thing was in my head, I can imagine a father or a mother making this flute for a kid to play, and it was hard to make, and it took them hours and hours to make. And then kid takes somewhere and loses it.
That sounds about right. That sounds like
and like, where is
no appreciation?
Where is your flute? I lost that.
I don't remember where. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's immediately in my head.
You must know, and I'm so sorry if you did an episode about this and I didn't review it. Did you look at Sungir in Russia, the burial? Do you know that one? If you don't, you're going to love this.
That's right.
No, this is the 3 burials. There's the double burial of 2 children and then the adult burial of a male. Do you know this one? Oh my gosh. Okay. This goes right to what you're talking about with the idea of the amount of work that is going into these things. One of my colleagues in the field did some really neat experimental archaeology to figure out how long does it take to make an ivory bead. So an ivory bead comes from mammoth tusk and they have to shape it down into a circle and then they have to drill a hole through it so it can be strung. It takes about an hour once you're good at it. So at first, obviously, it's slower. Once you get pretty good, you can do one in about an hour. So in Sungir in Russia, so this is, again, part of that Gravettian culture where they had a bit more time, a bit more stability. So they did have the ability to specialize or to spend more time probably on these artistic creations. But this one's such a great one. I always use it when I go to schools. So there was an adult male, I believe he was in his 40s, really elaborate burial, like 2,500, so 2,500 beads. Each one takes an hour. So do the math on that. 2,500 hours went into the ground with him and vanished forever. All of that labor was not even being enjoyed on a living person's clothing, right? Dead man gets all these things. They go in his burial. Okay. He's in his 40s. Maybe he's a shaman. Maybe he's a leader. Maybe he has some important role. Maybe he spent a lifetime making them himself. We don't know, right? But there is another burial right there. And it is a double burial, head to head, 2 kids. I believe the boy is around 10 or so and the girl is around 8. And the boy has 3,500 beads, so 3,500. So way more beads. And the little girl has 5,000 beads. And these would all have been sewn onto their clothing. So they're all in like these rows, like you can tell they would have been sewn onto the clothing. The kid's burial also has straightened mammoth tusks in it. Do you know how hard it is to do? You have to soak them and bend and soak and bend. Like it would have been so slow. And there's beautiful little horse engravings and like these wheels. It is the most stunning burial. It's probably one of the most elaborate burials in the whole of European Paleolithic. These 2 kids have way more elaborate burial than the grown male. Why? Like they're kids. What did they do to deserve it? We don't have huge hierarchy back then. I love doing this with schools. But I always am asking the kids because I'm like, well, what do you guys think? Why do you think the kids got all the fancy bling, right? You know, and they have such wonderful story ideas. Like maybe they saved the village from like, you know, saber-toothed tiger or like they got all sorts of really great stories. But, you know, I think that is such a great example of one of those things where you have to pause and be like, that is a lot of hours of labor to go into the ground. And it tells you not only really interesting things about the culture, but also about their belief system. It was worth adorning dead people to that level. They must have seen death as being some sort of transitional stage. It wasn't just the end. They didn't just cover them up in order to, you know, make sure that the scavengers didn't come by. These were burials done with huge amount of care and intent. And, you know, again, I mean, it could be something dark, like maybe the children were sacrificed or something, but we don't know. But there's no, I don't tell the kids that, but I always think that in my head. I'm like, well, they could have also been sacrificial victims. But the care and attention that went into those burials, though, and the amount of labor and hours that went into that, there's other levels of things going on that we can't access. But art, as you say, gives us the clue. gives us that like, aha, there is something going on here much more than just the basics.
There was these solitarian spearheads.
Okay.
Because I'm making an episode about that. I don't think they were spearheads at all.
Ooh, what do you think they were?
I have this idea because they're so beautifully done. They had most beautiful colors on them. They're not just black and white or like other spears of Magdalenian or Gravettian, but these spearheads are much bigger. And I was thinking, what if a hunter wants to go and hunt a deer, and for some reason their belief is to take one and stick it in the ground and say, this is my spot, like a ritual. And most of them are found in the upwards position when they discover.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So it could be some sort of talisman, or because again, I mean, that's one of the interpretations of the art potentially too, is that some of the art could have represented, you know, some sort of hunting rituals, some sort of sympathetic magic. There are images of animals that have strike marks on them. Yeah. Maybe they were carrying them as talismans, like some sort of good luck in the hunt. Yeah, there's so many levels that we don't know. And I mean, I think that's even with the art, I think we really have to get our head around is that all the art was not made for one reason. You know, it was made with the same variety of reasons likely that we have in our modern world. Some of it might have been path markers in caves. Some of it could have been educational. Some of it could have been almost functional, like we are counting the number of days till the full moon. There could be hugely deep, important stories embedded in some of these images as well, like the deep mythology of these people. I suspect it's the entire range is what we're seeing, and the big thing's trying to figure out what is what.
Yes. But that brings me to one question that I'm burning to ask you since a few questions ago. If art, for example, Egyptian art, is made basically for the dead people in the tomb.
Yeah.
It's not meant for us to see them and admire them. Egyptian culture and then Roman culture, Greek culture, art is made to exaggerate human body and to make it divine and closer to gods, or Islamic
and also
art.
very public as well.
Exactly.
They like their public art,
or Islamic art where everything is in the patterns of calligraphy.
Yeah.
And so different cultures have different ideas what art is and what is represent. What is the border between symbolism of that art and what is communication of that art?
Ooh, very good one. Okay. Really good question. Yeah, no. So for my dissertation, I mean, this was kind of one of the big things I was trying to tackle a bit, was trying to understand, again, function, representation, meaning. These are all slightly separate but related things potentially, right? And again, it's going to depend very much on context. Where do we find it? What is it being used for? Obviously, the people we can ask have been dead for a very long time, so we can't ask them. So we have to really try and infer by sort of what's going on around it in a way, right? And so one of the things I really tried to understand, and I continue to sort of really look into, is to understand that true symbolic graphic marks do not seem to happen until later. Like, that's just the reality. It seems to be a later occurrence that comes out of the invention of writing, like full-blown writing systems. And I think, again, we want to be really careful because writing systems aren't like the end goal. If you're a group 30 to 50 people hanging around the landscape, you don't need full-time scribes. You don't need a really fancy written language. Everybody you want to talk to is right there. Right? Yeah. Like, you don't need it. What people misunderstand is it's not like people are less evolved, and I'm using air quotes here, because they don't have a full writing system. It's more they had a really effective system of art and communication that worked within the context of small hunter-gatherer tribal groups who connected with other people who had very similar, if not the same culture, in the areas around them, which means what they needed were good symbols in the sense of maybe like a clan sign, a tribe sign, a family sign. You know, maybe there's certain mythological characters who play very important roles in their collective stories if it's a larger culture group, or specific animals, you know, if we're looking at more modern indigenous cultures where certain animals might represent certain secret societies or certain hunting groups, or like there's lots of ways to organize. So I think we need to think about the fact that the categorization of the signs as being a group is a modern bucket that we have put these into. I do not actually think that the geometric signs are all part of one interconnected system. I think we are looking at a range of things that we just didn't know in the past. The researchers just didn't know where to put them because they weren't animals and they weren't humans. And so they stuck them into this bucket they created called geometric signs. And I think that there's actually a jumble of things in there that range from very symbolic to very functional. And so what the work I did for my dissertation, I really tried to break down and understand what do we find in all of the earliest proto-writing systems. So the very earliest times that we start to see people get a little more organized using, maybe linear groups of symbols together, starting to try and communicate. Sadly, it's mostly transactions for economics. It's like the most banal thing ever. You don't find really symbolic symbols yet. It's more like, they started drawing an ox head instead of the whole ox because it was really annoying to have to draw an entire ox every time they wanted to make a reference to it. So they start shorthanding. But it's still iconic. There is still a connection to the original, what they call the referent, the thing it refers to. There's still, you can be like, oh, look, it's a cute little stick figure of an ox head. Oh, there's the ox. Okay, we get it. And it's not until later that you see these things get split apart and that some things become fully symbolic. The letter A in English, the there is nothing about that little shape that is like, other than we've all collectively agreed in English that it's an sound, right? When we're that far back, what we're seeing with the signs is probably in many cases stylized versions of iconic representations of the real world. And so I do believe that some of the quote unquote geometric signs are probably related to hunting. So some of them could be hunting implements in certain situations. Again, where's the landscape? Where's the trees? Where's the flowers? Where's the different rivers, mountains, all these things which we find in other early graphic systems. Maybe they're also there, but we just did not discerning them because of the eyeglasses we were wearing as modern researchers when we approached it. Over time, we don't ever have all 32 of those signs being used at once. This is more over the course of 30,000 years. We see some signs are high in popularity and then they fall off and disappear. This other sign gets invented for the first time. So for instance, the penniform, the earliest version of it we have in Europe at the moment is about 20,000 years ago in France. After that, it starts to spread out across the landscape. But it didn't exist before then. Or like I was saying before with the hands, where negative hands were really popular 30, 40,000 years ago. By the time you're hitting 20,000, they're very unusual. They're gone off the landscape for sure by about 15,000. Nobody's making them anymore. So the cultural context, when we're looking at simpler things like, say, the dots, which, by the way, in case you're wondering, dots are probably my favorite sign, just because they're really simple, but they can have so many meanings, right? They can be counting. They could be constellations. They could be wounds on the side of animals in some contexts. They could be path markers in caves. There are so many things that a dot could be. Another one is spirals. Spirals don't appear in Western Europe until 22,000 years ago, but they do appear earlier in Eastern Europe in the Gravettian culture. And so they're a fascinating example of something that may have come through with one of the genetic waves of people who came after the last glacial maximum. I'm actually doing a really interesting new paper with a colleague who studies more the Neolithic and ethnobotany. And we were talking about the fact that apparently there's a type of rhododendron bush. I'm not sure if you ingest it or quite what you do with it, but if you do something with it, it puts you into an altered state of consciousness and you see whirling spirals. Now, if you were in a culture area where there was no rhododendrons that you could use to see whirling spirals, you wouldn't have them in your culture. But if you were in a part of the world where you had these rhododendrons, and he was looking at the Siberian cultures from the Neolithic onwards, this is part of their medicine, this is part of what they do in ritual, and they have spirals. Right now, it's like we're peeking through a keyhole into a room, and we only see this little bit. We can make good guesses, but this is where we have to really think of the fact that the geometric signs are not some monolithic group that were used. Certain places and certain times, there were specific signs that were incredibly popular and that were obviously very meaningful to the people who made them. When those people died off, when those people moved, when the world changed around them, right? Their cultural changes would have reflected that. I think the geometric signs change with them.
You spoke about medicine and hallucinogenics in a lot of cultures are not drugs, they're medicines.
Yes, that's why I called it that.
Yeah. Drugs on English is very confusing because you have illegal drugs and legal drugs.
Yeah.
And it's very cultural. All other languages than English is medicine, medicina. And then you have drugs like heroin.
Yeah.
Do you know the Stone Ape theory?
Was this one where the apes may have been eating something and that maybe it helped expand their minds? Is that kind of, I have heard it. I don't know it well enough to really speak on it. So often I wouldn't be surprised if there is some almost like side effect of something. Like, do you know what I mean? Like I honestly think probably even the earliest paintings, I think the first things we painted were our bodies. And I suspect it was probably for some really boring reason, like the fact that ochre on the body actually acts as insect repellent. Then people were like, hey, I kind of like this red look. Or then somebody showed up with purple ochre one day and everybody's like, dang, that's a nice look. You know, and then suddenly, and then, so number one function or whoa, what was this funny side effect I just got from eating this fruit or from eating this seed that I was not expecting as an ape potentially as well. And now it's making my brain think in new ways I hadn't thought about before, right? So I think so often you have these, I guess it's almost like serendipity combined with, oh, neat, we're going to go this way now, and now this thing's going to happen. Deep history is full of these amazing stories of people who went right instead of left, or because of it, they survived. And that's, you know, where our ancestors come from. You know, and so again, I wouldn't be surprised if kind of like some of the researchers, my colleagues who study, you know, the origins of fire, figure the reason why fire probably came around in certain areas and stuck around was because at first they may have been sourcing it from, say, bubbling pools of lava. Because there are places in Africa where there's kind of like lava at the surface that's not violently exploding. So again, at certain times in deep prehistory, our hominin ancestors who'd figured out how to use fire may not have been able to make it yet themselves, but they knew where to go source it. Over time, maybe they figured out how to make it. We saved these coals, we can take it with us. Or like you can sort of see how these little brain jumps happen. And it very well could be some relationship we don't quite understand at this point between the hallucinogenics, the expansion of the mind in some ways, to the kind of imagination that we have. Because the imagination we have is unusual. There are not a lot of species with our imagination. And I believe that is one of the things that does make us a little bit different. Now, there's other species for sure who can do what we call like mental time travel, meaning they can plan ahead. But I think our capacity to create entire worlds is unusual. That ability to create entire worlds inside our head and then our need to share those worlds with others. Because I think that is one of the other things that's really interesting about humans is that we want to tell people about our stories, whether it's a visual story with your art or a written story. But we want to share, we want to imagine things that are not directly in front of us. And that is a very unusual quality. And I am not exactly sure how it happened. But, and again, there's some relation to tools and planning ahead with tools on a very mundane level. I'm not enough of a neuroscience specialist to say, but it's a very interesting sidetrack to wonder how and where imagination really came from, because it's fascinating.
I have this puzzle in my head.
I know.
This is my contribution.
Yeah, please.
I read a lot about these theories of one ape takes a mushroom and over generation and generations and generations, thousands of years.
Of course, yeah.
Suddenly we became hominids. Evolution is a very slow and long process. But when it comes to art, the revolution in art happens at once and it spreads like wildfire. In Sulawesi cave, they found that it was first 40,000 something, the oldest art. Now they're pushing back and pushing back. I'm certain there is more art to be found that's probably even older. And
I'm working on it right now. That's literally my new mission.
Okay.
I'm tracking the genetic lineages backwards. That's one of my new things that I'm doing.
Then you know about this 72,000 years ago, a rock.
The one from Blombos. The one from Blombos with the red. Oh, I mean, this is the thing, is that when you're that far back, like one of the things that really blew my mind, and in Russia, there is a wooden totem that they found in a bog beside what used to be a paleo lake. It is 14,000 years old. Isn't that insane that wood survived for 14,000 years? The Shagir idol, mind-blowing. This thing was meters tall. It's completely carved in geometric signs, of course, with the head of a person, a really stylized carved head on top of it. It looks like it was positioned right at the edge of the lake. And they found remnants of other wooden things at other lakes because of just the conditions of survival 14,000 years ago. So when I'm thinking about the landscape, I'm always imagining it being shaped by the people who lived then, right? And we can't see it anymore because it's all covered in dirt, or it's like just, it's disintegrated, or it's been weathered and it's gone. But I suspect that our ancestors have been making marks and shaping their landscape in a way, and interacting with the landscape in artistic ways, in ways of, again, sending signals or signs, even if it's just they were wondering, like, is this to let people know this is somebody's lake, or was this some sort of lake spirit, some sort of protector guardian of the lake? They don't know, but this thing is huge and a lot of work. Or when I've worked in Portugal out in the open, or the recent work I was doing in Jordan in the Middle East, the landscape likely was very much the canvas, just like I suspect the human body was an early canvas, and we're only getting tiny remnants of what was left, and I think the richness of the culture. And so for me, I feel like, again, we're working with scraps here and we're trying to expand those scraps, but it's so easy for us to almost get stuck in certain ways of thinking. And I think we have to do our best to be very open-minded, to recognize there might be entire things we have not even thought of. Like, look at the Denisovans. There was another whole species floating around in Asia we didn't even know existed.
With this green thing that they drilled, do you know how did they drill? Please tell me.
See, that is a weird piece. It may come from a younger layer. And so it's possible that it is actually Neolithic, which would make sense. But they have something which is what they call a diadem. It's like a headpiece that I believe it's bone, could be ivory, but is Denisovan. And it's like 50,000 years old, and it would have been worn as an actual head ornament. They were wearing ornaments.
But that means that our cousins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, even Homo naledi, made art.
If the listeners take nothing else away today, it should be that what we don't know so vastly outweighs what we do. And I think that as scientists, one of the things I'm always very aware of is that, everything we think we know, like, again, there is basic things we do know. We learn new things all the time, which open up our minds to new possibilities we hadn't thought before. And sometimes it's things like we didn't have the dating technology before. And so we were limited by our tools in many ways, right? And then also limited in, sort of carrying forward some of the Victorian era thinking of primitives and savages and how old the earth was, and like all that sort of stuff we've kind of had to work our way through. But even when it comes to, could Neanderthals make art, or were women and children making art, or like there's so many funny, weird things that have sort of shaped the field. And this other thing is, which kind of, this is the point I wanted to make, speaking of our cave there, our Blombos cave with the 73,000-year-old red paint marks. So, well, there's the question, isn't it? And this is why I'm saying I think it's actually a lot older. I think, and so again, maybe it goes back to your Stone Aged apes. Maybe they started doodling fun things they were seeing in their visions.
I made an episode about origins of humans and origins of art and this Blombos cave in South Africa. And I had an idea, and I said it in the episode. When you're speaking with somebody on the phone, and you have a pen and you have a paper, and you just start doodling stuff, doesn't mean anything. We will never know. But what if one of these arts that we found is actually that, just doodling?
Well, of course it could be. Well, if you remember, I talk about doodling in my book, though, because doodling is culturally based. We don't doodle things that we have not seen, which is really intriguing, too. So you're not going to doodle spirals if nobody's ever done a spiral around you, or if you don't know the shape. So it's wild. What is it? The nature versus nurture, right? What is wired versus what is learned is so intriguing. And I mean, art is definitely complex enough that I think in general it's probably taught. With that said, certain people definitely have a lot more natural capacity, I think, to do incredible works of art. Truly, I'm like the queen of stick figures. I am not a good artist. I have huge appreciation, right?
No, but everybody can learn how to draw, I promise you.
Yes. Oh, I believe it too. But I think some people have more natural skill at it than others, right?
Yeah, of course. But if you...
Kind of like I can excavate a square. I just don't really like to.
Exactly. And when I was in secondary art school, one of the first assignment, we found it so boring, but now it's one of the brilliant things that we did.
Ooh,
teacher told us there's a statue. Well, nobody sees it. This is the statue that I made when I was 16.
Oh my goodness, that's beautiful.
Oh, my girlfriend's gonna kill me. It's not a spot here.
Okay.
But she's not home. So the idea was to make, I'm lying now, but let's say 50 drawings of...
one statue, okay.
One statue, just in a line.
Ooh.
And it was so boring for us to draw over and over and over again.
Was there improvement, though?
And then teacher said, okay, show me your first and show me your 50th. There was a huge difference.
Yeah.
Between first and second and third, nothing.
Yeah.
But first and 50th.
Huge.
I remember him saying, now imagine that everybody does it for hundreds of drawings of one glass. And we were all amazed how brilliant it was. We all can draw, yes.
Yeah.
When we went to the 50th.
It was so much more refined.
Yeah. The line was more natural. There was no, how you say, first drawing is a little bit like this.
Hesitant, right? Like you're kind of doing it by little bits and pieces,
The last one, perfect symmetry, perfect representation of the statue, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
Why I'm telling you this, because when we see in the caves, it's almost one line.
Yeah.
That artist had made so many of them, but where are those that he tried to make?
Maybe again, though, this could be what we call like taphonomic processes. So taphonomic means when sort of like different materials have different lives, right? So if they were doing them on, say, an animal skin, that's not going to last for very long. Or if they were doing them on wood, like on bark or on little portable slabs of stone. And again, we have slabs of stone which aren't as impressive as the walls. So it could be that there was probably many places. Heck, I mean, when I was seeing out with the Bedouin in the desert, one of the guys there was a really good artist. He was drawing the most incredible things in the sand. Like he drew my kids, birds and camels. It was gorgeous. And it was literally in the sand. And then he just rubbed it over afterwards, right? So again, the stuff in the caves, we're probably seeing like on those big panels where it looks like they put a lot of time and effort into it. Because I will say there are other ones where it looks like a quick doodle or literally somebody was bored on a rainy afternoon in the cave, right? Like there is stuff like that. It just doesn't make the books. Oh my gosh, I've got some fantastic, terrible art. I take photos of it every time I see it because I'm like, someday we should do a coffee table book of all the terrible art that nobody ever sees. But then there's, of course, the beautiful stuff that, you know, is naturalistic. And as you said, it's single line. These people knew what they were doing. But with the kids, in recent years, there's been some fascinating studies showing lots of examples of kids doing like sort of meanders down cave walls, like on soft cave walls with their fingers. There's lots of evidence of children being involved. They're present, they're nearby, maybe being babysat by bigger kids. So a cave like Rouffignac, for instance, has tons of interesting evidence of little people hands because the fingers are so close together, like they're measuring the distance between the fingers, the width of the fingers, makes it look like it was children who made them. So I think that, again, there likely was a lot of, as you were saying, many people were often probably involved. It's just probably the person who, again, had the skill to do that single line may have been the one who got to do the big stuff on the fancy panels, right?
Yeah, when everybody can see it. But
exactly.
Every person that is on my podcast, I ask them 3 questions as the last questions. And
okay, good. Let's do it.
First question, what is art?
Ooh. Art is a very easy little 3-letter word that certainly in my field we use as the net under which we put all graphic markings. So I think in art, large to me, is any visual mark that is made on a surface. I think, though, then there could also be art as in the sense of something that is meant to evoke something, which would be a very different category than something functional and graphic. So I think that maybe there's 2 levels of it, and it sort of depends, because in the West, we have notions of what is art as, again, being something like an incredible, you know, bison or like a beautiful Monet. Like there's things that we would consider to be art because of the feeling that they give us. And I personally feel like there is an interaction between the viewer and the art when we're talking about art. Maybe capital A art almost, like what we'd say is capital A art is an image that is designed to be a visual message to a viewer with feeling and a sense of something versus functional marks, which we use the term Paleolithic art, but then I'm almost using art with quotations around it, right? Like in that point, we're talking about visual marks. So I would say art has 2 levels to it from my field's perspective. The big one, any visual mark that is meant to communicate something. Capital A art was the pieces that were very much designed to connect the artist with a later viewer.
Second question.
Yeah.
If you could have a dinner with anybody in the world, any period of time, who would it be and why?
Oh my gosh, there's so many people I want to talk to.
Not some cave artist, no?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I think that yes. Okay, so in that sense, I'm also a really big fan of philosophy, and there's a few other folks I'd like to have a meal with. Marcus Aurelius would be fascinating. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah.
Right? See, as I was saying, I can think of a few people that I would love to have a chat with. But if I had to pick, just trying to think, who would I really want to talk to? I want to talk to the person who made. It's from Siberia. There's 4 mammoth bones, like knuckle bones, were carved into these figurines. Weirdest feelings I've ever felt. They're so simple, and yet there is something about them that is very deep. I don't know how else to describe it. I would be very interested in talking to the person who made those. But I think that absolutely there's a few places and art pieces in particular where I would be like, I would like to sit down and have a chat with you about why you made this thing, because I have some ideas, but I'd be curious to hear if I'm right. There's some places in El Castillo Cave, for instance, in Spain, where I would love to speak to the person who made that art. How's that? There's lots of things. Oh, I know the one. Okay, I'm going to pick one. Sorry, there's so many. In the heart of El Castillo Cave, it is down at another level. You actually have to scramble down this terrifying, slippery calcite thing to get down to it. There is a room, it's a chamber, in almost the heart of the mountain where the walls are all glittering. It's just the most incredible quartz sort of flecks that are inside the walls of the calcite. And on the floor, somebody engraved a scene. It literally would have been done in what would have been soft mud at the time. And it looks like a horse in the foreground. Frankly, it looks like a tent because there's almost what looks like smoke coming out of the top of it. And then there's somebody took their tool and stabbed it into the floor, almost like, I don't know, snow or raindrops. It's the wildest thing I've ever seen. Oh my gosh, it's never been published. I know. I got the chance to go see it. And you have to go through quite the torturous, like you have to scramble through tiny spots. Like it is hard to get to. Literally, you swing your foot over a calcite formation and slide down this really dangerous calcite formation to even get down to the right level because you have to drop down a level. And then you have to crawl through this thing which has all the spikes. Like it's like literally, it's quite the mission to even get there. And then you come out into this glitter chamber with this incredible floor engraving. I believe they think it's around 17,000, so it's Magdalenian. What is going on in there? I have a feeling it's, if you want my guess, I think it's some sort of origin story. I suspect it's probably a very important mythological story. I would love to speak to the person who made that. If I had to speak to anyone, I'd like to talk to them and know what was going on.
Yeah, but they're all hidden and very remote. And the rest of cave is like, this is art.
Yeah.
More fascinating stuff are always in the back where nobody can see it.
I know. Or like the well in Lascaux, where there's that scene again where there's a man who looks like he's been stabbed by, is the rhino the one with its guts hanging out? There's a whole lot going down in that well. Like, again, it looks like a scene. There's a bird on top of a staff. Like, there's a whole lot going on there. And so those are the ones I find very intriguing. I would love to speak to the person and understand what was the story behind it. I think we'd understand a lot more about that culture if we understood why they did that.
And the third question, I know that you will be remembered, but how would you like to be remembered?
I don't care if people remember my name. I think we're all collectively adding to the human story, right? Unless you're some horrible person who gets remembered for centuries because of you being so terrible. I mean, most of us will become footnotes and then eventually nobody will know our names. But if I have done my job right, I will have contributed to our collective knowledge. And also the big thing I'm really working on now, and if I come back, we can talk about it more. I'm starting to build a global database and I want it to live beyond me. This isn't the Genevieve project. This needs to be like a humanity project. I'm just getting it started, which will be the collective repository of human art and culture from the ancient world. I want it all to be in one place so that we can all, yes. And so everybody can access it. You can access it. Anybody can. I am literally working with AI right now as a collaborator. The artificial intelligence and I are actually building it together to future-proof it so that it could be something that survives into the future. And so we can stop the decay and we can start to preserve and protect. Because if we can get all of these things into one place, there's also huge, incredible potential for global patterns, for noticing things that maybe we wouldn't have seen if it was all separated off. And so this is the vision, is I really want to get it all in one place for many different reasons, for reasons in the present, reasons in the future. So think of it in a way as almost like the seed vault, but for ancient human art and culture. It's kind of the goal.
Well, thank you, Genevieve, for that. But also thank you for doing this podcast. And
yeah,
you said if my audience wants, I don't care. I care what my audience wants, but I want to talk with you.
Well, let's do it. In August, I'm going to be running off for a bit, but I'll be back in August. So we can always connect in August and have a bit of a catch up. But I might even be able to talk a little bit more about what I'm starting to work on with the database, because I'm very, very excited. It makes my heart very happy. It's what I've wanted to do since I was an undergraduate. You know, everything takes longer than you want it to.
Yes, and I can show you even how I envision my first book of art history.
Love it. That's amazing.
Yeah, because I'm going to do all of my illustrations. Hopefully find somebody who will give me some photographs of the actual places.
You can use my photographs if it's anywhere I've been.
Oh my God, I'm going to start crying right now.
Always. Yeah.
Yeah, really.
I've now worked at over 100 cave art sites on 4 continents. Isn't that wild? I've been to Rising Star. I've actually been to the Homo naledi site. I was one of the people who went to go look at the art there. So I have had the privilege at working just the most incredible places, and I've got lots of awesome photos and things too. I mean, and this is where, again, my recent adventures in Jordan, which I've been sharing online, because people are always like, what's it like in the field? So I was like, you know what? I will bring you with me. You can come see Genevieve's all like dirty and sweaty and dangling off a cliff half the time. Oh my gosh, the next episode that's coming out, I climbed up there, and it was one of those ones I was so enthusiastic about climbing up that I was like, I didn't entirely plan how I was going to get back down. It's one of those where I tend to get really enthusiastic, and then I'm like, oh dear, I did not completely plan how I'm going to reverse this and get back down. So then you kind of have to do, you know, the thing where you kind of put your hands on the wall and kind of wiggle down because there's not really a good way to get down. Kids, don't pay attention, because my kids come with me. So I'm always like, don't do what I do. Oh my gosh, my 7-year-old. Oh, he loves caves. He's always into coming into caves. So my older son is amazing too. I joke, he's my little research assistant. When we were in the Middle East, we were doing LiDAR scanning at some of the sites of the engravings. He was teaching our Bedouin colleagues how to do it. And he's just turned 12. He's amazing. So yeah, he's traveled with me all over the world since he was 13 months old, when I was breastfeeding him outside Comart Cave in France. Literally, I had to crawl into the cave to go feed him. And then I would go back in. My colleagues were like, I was like, okay, I gotta go. I'll be back, right? Oh, yeah. So that was really funny. So yeah, they've been traveling with me since they were kids.
I will put your YouTube channel.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I finally got around to making one so that way if people want to check out what I'm doing, I've got it kind of all in one place. So there's academic talks, TED Talks. I did a really fun genetics talk at a local high school near where I live, which was really fun, talking about the power of genetics, if anyone wants to learn more about that side of things. Yeah, technology is opening doors for us that we didn't even know existed before. It's pretty exciting. It's a great time to be in the field.
And why a book, The First Sign?
Thank you, Eldon, for having me on your show. Oh, I had a good time chatting with you.
Yeah.
I like your ideas.
When they say, don't meet your heroes, you will be disappointed. So far, all of my heroes that I met, I was never disappointed.
I do it for you and for all the people. I have this incredible privilege that I have a passion I get to do as a job, which is, an amazing, amazing gift. So I really do believe that part of my mission is to report back to the rest of humanity, because I get to go places where most people don't go. And to me, that is something I feel is really important, is that we need to knock down the walls that make people feel like they don't have a place being involved in the collective knowledge of humanity, because everybody does. And I think that we're finally moving into an era where those barriers are hopefully starting to come down. And certainly wherever I work in the world, I'm very much training and supporting local people to be able to start managing their own cultural heritage, because it's everywhere and it belongs to all of us, and we all deserve and have the right to see it, to understand it, and to be a part of it. It's the book of humans, right?
Yes,
yeah.
In the end, we are all just a grain of the sand in the whole story of humanity.
Yes, yeah. I think the work that you do, the work that I do, what so many people do who want to see the world be a better place, is that we're trying to remind people about the similarities and the fact that, we all are cousins. We're all people. We're all humans. We're all cousins. The differences between us are so minute, they're hardly worth mentioning. Deep time, we were all the same people. The cultural splits hadn't happened yet. So there was no boundaries. There were just humans. So it's a pretty cool time. And I think that's where it resonates with people a lot too, is because this belongs to everyone, no matter where they live in the world.
That's a very nice touch for ending this.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Genevieve, for...
It's my pleasure, Eldon. Thank you for having me on. I'm glad you had fun too.
No, I most definitely did. So,
Aw, that's so kind. Well, it was lovely to meet you. I'm
yeah.
glad I didn't let you down or disappoint you.
Oh no, far from it, far from it. Opposite.
Good. It was a
Yes.
pleasure. But yeah, we can do part two for sure. I still had lots more to say. We didn't even talk about the Middle Eastern stuff I've been working on because we've been doing some really neat stuff there with the roots out of Africa and stuff. So
I
we'll
didn't
talk
ask
more.
you so many stuff about music.
Oh, I know, right? Yeah, there's some
Uh,
interesting stuff going on there. Okay, let's talk in August, okay? It was a
yes.
pleasure, Eldon. Okay, thank you so much. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
day. Okay,
Bye.
bye.
This concludes this episode. I want to thank you for joining and listening. I hope we inspired you. I hope you learned something.